JargonFree Radio.
JargonFree Radio with pension guru Steve B. Brought to you by Little Voice Media, the video and audio specialists.
Okay, so this is JargonFree Radio again, and it's Steve B as usual. And this month our special guest is Bill Galvin, the Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator. Bill, hello.
Hello, Steve.
Now, Bill and I can't remember, we met a few months ago on a very rainy day down in Brighton, at your head office down there. And we've chosen a very rainy day to meet up here in London at the end of the year to record this, this radio broadcast.
Well, I hope you're not reading anything into that. The regulator always brings about weather.
Well, no, it's not that we don't want to see it. No, I just so everybody listening knows, we're recording this at the very end of 2011. But the radio show is planned to go out at the beginning of 2012. 2012, a very important year, I think, in our pensions world in the UK, with these major changes coming on. And of course, Bill, those changes themselves have been changed in the last few weeks. I don't know whether you want to start by talking about that.
Sure. I mean, it's a very big year for us, 2012. Because we've got to regulate both the supply side and the demand side for automatic enrolment. So employers, their duties to put people into pension schemes, and then the pension schemes themselves to make sure that they're fit for purpose in terms of taking people on in automatic enrolment and looking end to end of that system, trying to make sure it works and that the linkages between employers and scheme works. The government, like you say, has recently changed the profile with which these duties are going to fall on employers. So employers of 49 employees and below have now been told that they're not going to be required to do this until after the next election, and the government's shortly going to announce what the revised staging profile would be. But the key message from us is this is still going to happen. It's going to apply to all employers. For the big employers who are already preparing for this, there is no change. They need to continue at current course and speed because the duty is going to fall for them as we've told them it will fall. And for the people who will follow on from that, very early in the new year, we'll be contacting them again and letting them know when their date is going to be.
Now, I suppose with this, next year, these new regulations coming in, or these new duties coming in, beginning to come in for employers, as you say, of all sizes, larger employers in this country, for decades really, have typically been the ones who've provided pensions, whereas the smaller firms aren't. So this is quite a revolution, really, bringing maybe more than 1 million employers into provision of workplace pensions. But many of them will have heard, I think, of the Pensions Regulator for the first time, or are about to hear about the Pensions Regulator for the first time. But of course, the Pensions Regulator hasn't come about because of these reforms, which, even though most people might seem to think that, but we've got quite a history of regulation of our pension system in the UK. I wonder if for our general listener, if you like, we can perhaps touch on a bit of the history of the pension regulation system itself in the UK.
Sure. Well, you're right. 1.3 million employers are going to be affected by these new duties. And as the pensions regulator, although we've been around for some time, we generally deal most intensely with the 7,000 or so employers that have defined benefit pension arrangements in place. And there are another good proportion of employers who have stakeholder schemes or defined contribution pensions in place. We deal with those on a less intense basis up until now, but nevertheless they will have heard of us. It's interesting, we've just done some research with these 1.3 million employers and said, we're the pensions regulator, have you heard of us? I was quite encouraged that half of them said, yes, we've heard of you. The other half said, who? But of the half that had heard of us, only about between 10 and 20% said, yes, we know you well and we understand what you're about. The others kind of thought they knew who we were and what we did, but weren't very sure. So we've got a job to do to make sure that we get in front of people, let them know what we're about and how we're going to take on these new tasks.
You're listening to JargonFree Radio with Steve B and special guest Bill Galvin, Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator.
I suppose there's no reason really for vast, large number of smaller employers in the UK to have ever heard of the Pensions Regulator, but it will be part of your role going forward as these reforms, even though they're extended now over a slightly longer period, as they gradually take effect. 1.3 million employers, as you say, will have a direct relationship with the Pensions Regulator. There'll be specific things they'll need to do, registering and things like that.
They will do. So they will have to automatically enrol their people into a pension scheme, provide information about that process, and then come and register with us to say that they've done that. Now the good news is that we're going to give people plenty of warning. We're going to write to people, to the larger employers 18 months in advance, and we've already started that. We've already written to over 600 employers and said it's coming, it's 18 months, you've got to prepare. We'll write to all employers 12 months in advance of when these duties fall due to them, and we'll remind them again 3 months in advance of that.
Right, so there is a process already in place to do that?
Yes, absolutely, and we have the names and addresses of all employers. We get that from HMRC because they've got their PAYE schemes registered there, and we will contact them all. We're also doing an awful lot of education and awareness work with employers, their sector bodies, their representative groups, their advisors that will work with employers, accountants, IFAs, employee benefit consultants. And we're tracking very closely the levels of awareness and understanding in the industry of these changes and what they mean. We're encouraged by the results as we go into 2012. I think we're very encouraged that amongst employers of 250 employees and above, the levels of awareness and understanding of what they need to do and when they need to do it by are up towards the 90% mark. And that's very, very high. We're very pleased with that. We still have a lot of work to do, particularly with the micro employers, even though their duties don't fall for another number of years, the employers with below 5 employees. But we want them to know that this is coming. We want them to understand that they're going to have to do something and to have a rough idea as to when the duty is going to apply to them so that they can start planning and getting ready in advance.
Yeah, because if you see these things coming, along with I've been talking to employers about this for a while now, it just seems to me that being forewarned, you're forearmed really, aren't you? If you see it coming far enough away, there are a number of sensible things you can do to prepare for this, not least the cost of being required to contribute. And the later you see it, the fewer your sensible options available, I guess.
That's right. I mean, we've got our 7-step process that we're writing to all employers and telling them about, and those 7 steps apply whether you're the largest employer in the country or the smallest, because they're simple things like you need to know the date at which this applies to you, assess your workforce and understand who it applies to, understand who's eligible and who isn't, and so on and so forth. So although these steps are rather more simple when you've got a very small workforce, you've still got to work through them, plan for them in advance. With the larger employers, we've got an account management type system, so we'll ring them up, we'll go and visit them, we'll talk them through this process. With the mid-market, we're depending on advisors, IFAs and benefit consultants. And we're working very hard to make sure that those advisors have the right information, tools and awareness to work with their clients. And then with the smaller end of the market, we're very dependent on the non-pension specialist advisors,
the
accountants and bookkeepers. Yeah. And with those, we're working very closely with the profession, the ICAEW and the ACCA and those people to make sure that accountants who probably don't see this as core to their business, realise that this is coming and are prepared to let their clients know that it's coming and help them to plan and work through the issues.
Yeah, my guess is that for the larger firms, those who claim to know quite a lot about this already, that's not really come from the newspapers. This isn't something that's caught the imagination of the press thus far, I suppose, but I mean that surely must be coming to them through their professional connections, and the best way of that continuing down the scale, even down to the micro firms, is probably through those professional connections they already have running their payroll bureau or something like that. I've always thought that would be, you can't expect this stuff to get out through some kind of osmosis, but I do think there is already a structure there, business-to-business structure, that does reach down to the micro employees. Your 7 stages, 7 steps to pensions heaven, or whatever you call it, that's stage 1, of course, is the one that's been massively confused by this this stop-start thing, which has happened in the last few weeks, really, at the end of this year. In a way, I've looked at it as being quite a positive step, really, because most of the smaller employers will have to be told, won't they, your staging date used to be this and now it's this. For many of them, that might be what staging date, but even that's a good start, isn't it?
Yes, well, even the employers of between, say, 5 and 49 employees, which is one of the groups we look at, the awareness levels of that this is coming, that they have to contribute to a pension scheme and that they need to communicate to their employees is quite high. So people have seen this coming. And our key message has been know the date at which this is going to apply to you. Now that's going to change. So we have a task in the new year to go and explain to people that the profile for the rollout of automatic enrolment has changed, and this may mean that their date has changed, and they just need to come with us and check. But we've had great success in terms of providing quite simple tools on the website where people can come along with just their PAYE number, type it in, and it'll tell them their approximate date.
That's right, that's a useful tool.
And in any case, the dates didn't become set in stone until April of 2012, because it's the number of employees at that point in time. So people would have had an indication, but perhaps no great certainty.
So that's still not changing. That's an interesting point, isn't it? This fix in time at 2012, 6th of April, I take it, or the 5th, I don't know, it would be the end of the tax year, I suppose, probably the 5th. So it's that snapshot of your company there determines where it's size based, where you are in the staging date order.
That's the way it works. The number of employees that you have at that date will mean that you'll come in at a particular time. And for what we call newborns, companies that are formed post that date, they'll actually join the back of the queue and they'll come in towards the end of the process.
So if you're a growing business, I've got a growing business, it's a tiny business at the moment, but if it's fixed at the 5th of April next year with just a handful of employees, so it's a micro business, and if in 4 years' time we have 500 people or something like that, our staging date won't change because of that. It's fixed as next year.
That's the reference.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. And it's this kind of information that I guess people will need as they get nearer and nearer to these things becoming real. And the pensions to me has always been an information process. Employers need to explain pensions to their employees because so many people these days appear not to value the pensions that that they get, particularly workplace pensions, and even the good occupational pension schemes we've had in the past have had a fairly high opt-out rate, where the employers are paying the vast majority of the costs, the bulk of the costs, and employees still opt out of pension schemes. Opting out is a feature of the new pension environment we're heading for, where it will be an obligation on the employer to put employees into a scheme, but there's no obligation on any employee to stay in. But this message that by opting out you lose the employer's contribution, that's a strong one to get across, isn't it? Because the employers aren't allowed to give you that money any other way, or they'd be, it'd be some kind of inducement to you and others to leave the scheme.
No, there are certain behaviours that employers are not allowed to demonstrate. One of them is in recruitment, they're not allowed to give preference to people who don't intend to join the pension scheme. and they're not allowed to what's called induce people to opt out. Now, clearly employers will want to give people information about this process, and indeed the DWP will be providing standardised information that employers can give to their employees. Some employers are concerned that if they go into too much detail about the nature of the process, that they run the risk of stepping over the line into inducing people to opt out. But it's reasonably straightforward, and we've produced some guidance for people who are concerned about this. You know, you would have to have intent to encourage people out of the pension scheme really to breach those requirements, and conversations about pensions, the nature of the contributions, the nature of the employer contributions, are for the most part not going to breach those guidelines. People with cafeteria benefit systems just have to be slightly careful that the pensions part of that is compliant with the minimum contribution requirements.
You're listening to Jargon-Free Radio with Steve B and special guest Bill Galvin, Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator.
So the employers really, they must give information about pensions. This will never work if they're not able to do that. But they have to make sure they don't cross the fine line, some would say, and give advice on pensions. That's probably slightly more difficult for people to understand, although I suppose if an employee says to you, should I stay in the scheme once you put me in, that's a question that you really can't answer, isn't it? If you're an employer, you can't say, well, I wouldn't if I were you, or anything like that, because that's clearly giving somebody advice.
No, you can give the employee as much information about the nature of the scheme and the nature of the payments and the benefits as possible. And indeed, most of the providers will have this information to hand. But if employees ask employers about what they should do, then that is straying into the area of financial advice, either in terms of opting in or out, or indeed of the nature of the investments that they should make.
That's right. The employer's role in all this is to make the scheme available and to commit to pay towards it if people stay in the scheme. But they're not there to tell people whether or not they should be saving for a pension or have an ISA or something instead. That's nothing to do with them, is it?
No, and they don't need to be worried about being dragged into this space. The duties on the employers are quite clear. They need to provide a pension scheme. They need to provide information to the employee about the process and what's happening to them. And as I said, DWP will be providing standardised information.
There'll be some kind of pro forma they can use.
Exactly. And then they need to make contributions to that pension scheme. They also need then, once they've done all of that, to come to us and register and say, yes, we've done that. But those are the basic employer duties.
So, I mean, it just step back a bit from the whole process, I suppose. We're talking about quite a bit of the detail here. But if we step back, for the last 50 years or so, the state, through the DWP, today anyway, has been providing workplace pensions that are earnings related through the state second pension. Now, for all sorts of reasons that we all know and we haven't got time to go through here, that state second pension shape is changing now, and it's becoming a flat rate entitlement, a top up to the basic pension really. So the state's getting out of the business of providing workplace earnings related pensions for individuals, or for today about 12 or 13 million employees. And the employer really is being required to fill that gap, if you like. Now, personally, I think this is, I'm in favour, as you probably guess I would be, given the side of the fence I'm on, but I'm in favour of funded pension assets rather than unfunded pension. Although any economist, I'm sure, would say there's no real difference between the two, and I do understand that too. But I think at least if you've got money in a pot, it seems real. And it's no more secure than anything else. But it's this switch from maybe getting on for half the working population being dependent on the state for its earnings-related second pension. We're now moving that to employers. So the duties on employers really are to broadly replicate, well, not in detail, but replicate the role that the DWP has had for the last 50 years or so with the graduated pension scheme and the SERP scheme and now S2P as it is today.
Yeah, the government's made its intentions clear in this space, and Steve Webb, our pensions minister, since he's come into office, has been very clear that his desire is to make sure that the state pension provides a solid foundation for private savings, and he wants to do that by introducing measures that will maintain the value of that state pension over time, and the government has done that, and then to make that state pension as simple as possible in terms of an ambition to provide a flat rate state pension that provides a solid foundation, and that people's private savings can sit on top of that, and there will be less complication in terms of whether for a small segment of the population it might not pay in the long run to save. If that is ironed out, I think the decisions for people around private savings will become much more straightforward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess Steve Webb is doing what Beveridge set out to do, giving us a decent subsistence level pension so that every pound we save above that gives us a pound's worth of value. That's not something we've had with the spread of means testing for people over the age of 60 over the last sort of 15 to 20 years. So that's another reason 2012 is an important year, and as we kick this year off with this radio broadcast, I suppose, we've covered we've touched on the two main things, the employers having to take their role in pension provision in future, but also the state itself providing a decent foundation for our private pension savings to go on top of that. This will be one of the years that makes it in the sort of top three of pensions history, I guess, when that history is written one day in the future. But I don't know. I'm pretty upbeat about all this. I don't know what does the regulator get upbeat about things like that? Is it? I think this is a good step for our pension system, really.
2012 is a big year for the regulator, and we are as upbeat as you can be about it. It's a big year for us because it's the year really in which the preparations across employers, particularly large ones, but really employers of all sizes, and the industry and the supply side are all going to have to be in place. Only 27 employers or so are going to actually be called to the auto-enrollment duties in 2012. It'll start in October for the biggest employers in the country, and they'll be called in a phased way. And the 600 largest employers will come in up to April 2013. So in terms of the number of employers coming on board, it's quite phased. But in terms of the industry's preparation for what is the biggest change to workplace pensions in a generation, in terms of all the supply side activity that needs to go on to make that work, and in terms of all the preparation that needs to happen in employers, particularly the large employers with complex workforces that we're working very closely with, 2012 is a very, very big year indeed for the pensions industry.
Well, I think, Bill, we'll close this conversation here. I'm sure we'll have plenty more as these things unravel and start becoming real in the real world that all employers and employees live in. But I suppose describing 2012 as in those terms, the biggest change in pensions for a generation. I've been saying something similar to that for a while. That's not over the top. It's probably understating it, I think. 50 years of the system we've had up to now begins to change this year in 2012. That is a message, I think, if that's the message that gets out at the beginning of this year, it's quite a good one. But thank you for giving us that as a quote in our first broadcast of the year. We'll wind up this edition of Jargon Free Radio on that point. Bill, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good to talk to you.
JargonFree Radio.
You've been listening to JargonFree Radio, brought to you by Little Voice Media, the video and audio specialists. Please visit our website for further information and leave your comments below. Thanks for listening.